Thank you very much for being here with us today, and thank all of you. Also, before we begin talking, I want to show everybody the film that you've made, Bad River, or at least the trailer. So let's go to the trailer first.
This is a story of the Bad River people and their home on Lake Superior.
Our people have been here for millennia.
They've had to fight for who they are.
And the Ojibwe have been resisting ever since.
There was a black car they used to ride around. We see that coming, we'd run.
They basically just grab kids and take them off to these boarding schools.
They were modeled after prison systems.
It was a genocidal project.
The whole idea was your culture is primitive.
The oppression, the racism just hit a pinnacle.
It was all built up.
You punk. I thought Native people would get killed.
There's always some kind of threat.
They've had to fight to protect their land.
It seems improbable that a pipe would be hanging in midair.
That's a ticking time bomb.
When the meander reaches the pipeline,
Apocalyptic.
If it breaks, this is gonna pour right into Lake Superior. And that's bad.
It is the grandmother of the Great Lakes. It is the freshwater stronghold of planet Earth.
Trying to shut down a pipeline, that's a major endeavor.
It's a David and Goliath type of situation, right?
You gotta stop it.
My little tribe is protecting water for the planet.
It'll be one hell of a fight.
This is a story of defiance.
We gotta protect our water. To die for it. We have to.
So now that they've seen the trailer, before we begin, Mary, can you tell us where everyone can see the film after today's session?
Yes, thank you for asking, and great to be here, Aaron. So we just came out of theaters. The film amazingly lasted in theaters for 2 months. Shocking for a documentary. We are going to be debuting on Peacock in November. And in the meanwhile, there are special events. You can do pay-per-view, and if everyone comes to our website, badriverfilm.com, we would greatly appreciate it.
Excellent. Quannah, I want to start with you. You're one of the voices of the film. You and Edward Norton are the two narrators. And you also, we have two filmmakers and an activist on the stage. You're involved in the work of land guardianship. And I wanted to know sort of how that work brought you into this project.
Yeah, I just want to thank Mary for, giving me the opportunity. I think it's really, really important to show solidarity and stand with one another. There's so many indigenous people, across the world that are facing similar threats. I'm from Alaska, and, obviously the Bad River tribe is not from Alaska, but that fight is our fight. There's so many things that are happening in Alaska that are so related, and, there's so many nuances of, these projects and things that are threatening our ways of life and our people, our identity as indigenous people. But it's also like when I go home and I'm seeing the threat and I'm seeing the impact that it's making, and then I go somewhere else and I enter another indigenous community, it's almost the same thing. Yeah. And so it's really important, as a land protector, to stand in solidarity with my brothers and sisters that are, enduring the same kind of pain and hardship of losing land, language. Everything is so interconnected. It's so hard to talk about one thing without bringing up another. And so I'm just very blessed to be a part of this project. It's such an incredible film. Everyone needs to watch it. Mary did an amazing job. And the voices in there are just so powerful, and I feel so honored to be a part of it.
And I'm wondering for you what the emotional experience was like of learning about the history of the Bad River Band through reading the script. What was that experience like for you? Is that the first you kind of encountered the situation?
She was mad.
I was so mad, you guys. Yeah, it was actually pretty emotional. There were actually moments where I had to stop and read and kind of process what I was reading. I knew of a lot of these issues happening in other indigenous communities across Turtle Island, also known as North America. But I'm also so focused on what's going on back in my home. And, reading that and really understanding this issue and being a voice, it really opened my eyes to so much more. And it was definitely like an emotional experience reading the script. I mean, at one point I stopped and I looked at Mary and I was like, I am so mad right now. Like, I cannot believe I'm reading this and this is real. Like, people are saying these things and this is what's happening. And it's so heartbreaking, but you also see the power come through those Indigenous people and through the film.
So, Mary and Allison, I want to ask you about the history in the film, but I first want to, before we go to like the deep history, which I'm really interested in, I want to ask you if you can kind of situate where, like in the film itself, the condition of the pipeline that's at the center of this, that there is a Enbridge pipeline that's running through the Bad River Band's land. Can you talk to us about like the condition of it today and the precariousness of that pipeline that's at the center of this?
So, Al, I'll start. And I think, you know, here we have a Canadian pipeline that serves Canadian consumers primarily. It was installed in the 50s without the Bad River Band's consent. It cuts through the heart of the reservation. And here we fast forward 70 years. There are two salient points about this. Easements for about 3 miles of the pipeline corridor expired 10 years ago. The terms of the contract, the easement agreement, required the pipeline operator to cease and remove the infrastructure. A. B. Today, the Bad River is changing her course. She's meandering. And the pipeline, when it was originally installed, was about 150 feet away from the water. Today, it's 17 feet. When it hits the pipeline, there is a profound risk of rupture. And the Bad River Band, here is this tiny community, and they are fighting so hard to protect Lake Superior, because if this ruptures, it's in Lake Superior in a matter of hours. Mm-hmm. And as the former chairman said to me, we are using maximum effort, not just for ourselves, we are safeguarding this precious resource of fresh water for all Americans. And then we were in an event a couple of weeks ago, and he said, you know, what we're doing is our patriotic duty. Mm-hmm. Our patriotic duty, because it's in service to this country. Mm-hmm. And I thought, are we profanity-free here?
Well, so,
Holy
not.
so let's, in the context of patriotism and the history of the United States, I mean, one thing I found very interesting about your film is that to tell this story of a pipeline that, what did you say, is 50 years old?
Oh, no, 70.
70 years old. You go all the way back into like the 1800s and even before that. And it's interesting to me, I watch a lot of climate films and climate-adjacent films. I'm a juror in our Green Docs competition that's part of tomorrow's programming in the afternoon. Often there's this move where you start with like the history of climate change. You go to the Industrial Revolution, and it's a similar scope of time that you want people to engage with. Why did you feel it was so important to start with the entire history of the United States and the Western colonization? Why was that context necessary?
So I'm going to hit it over to Allison in a second, but what happened was we began interviewing elders. Yeah. And what was amazing about their story, they wanted to talk about the pipeline, the challenges with Enbridge today, but they said, did you know about the mining battle? And did you know about the walleye wars? And they went back in time to showcase not just the challenges, but their resistance and their resilience and how they fought back at every stage. And I think that was like the film meandered, because it went from a pipeline film into a historical retrospective. And I'm going to say my partner in crime, Allison Abner, who wrote for Narcos and West Wing, was with me every edit, every step of the way. And Allison said, Mary, we need to include the Dawes Act. Mm-hmm. And I was like,
eyes glazed over.
Yawn.
Why did we need the Dawes Act?
Well, you know, kind of the nexus for all of this, for what Mary's talking about the pipeline, and what Quannah's talking about you know, all the issues that are affecting, you know, tribes across the continent. It's no accident, and that is the historical policy of the United States government. And there's two pieces to it. One we kind of saw here with the Carlisle Indian School. I'm descendant from Stockbridge, Muncie, and 2 generations of my family went to Carlisle. And I, you know, grew up with stories about it because they had a famous football team that some family members played on. But when I was on the West Wing, I decided I really wanted to understand, like, what how did land how did they get dispossessed from their land, and sort of how do we get from there to here? And so I called spoke to the chairman of the Stockbridge-Munsee tribe here in Wisconsin, and he said, you need to look at the Dawes Act. And it was, mid-1800s. It was really a congressional act that essentially divided up all of the reservations that had been, through treaties had been agreed upon. And as they were divided and kind of sliced up into these smaller plots, each Indian family was given one plot, and the rest were sold at auction by the United States government. And that is how so many people who live in different parts of the United States, that is how they came into possession of the land. And the mythology, and one of the things that Mary and I talked about very early on, was that we needed to kind of dispel a lot of the mythology around, Little House on the Prairie, and, just sort of the pioneering, that people just plopped their, they saw empty land and plopped their thing and built a log cabin, and that it's like, no, this land, whole nations were dispossessed of their land. And in tandem, happening at the same time, it was mandatory for all children to go to Carlisle. And people do not understand that this was, you had to go for 5 years. And the whole point...
A boarding school.
A boarding school in Pennsylvania, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which had been an army barrack that was run by a Colonel Platt from the United States Army. And literally the kids were not allowed to speak their language. They, dress, have any of their customs. So it was meant as what's called an assimilation project, but it was so thorough and so devastating that after the kids would come back, they could not speak to their parents. Their parents often didn't even recognize them. So those two things together, and what Quannah is saying, that this has affected many generations later, is no accident. So
just real quick, just adding on to that, it just also shows that even today, why Indigenous people are so dehumanized. The quote of the schools, the residential schools back then, was "kill the Indian," because we weren't even seen as people, "save the man." So "kill the Indian, save the man" was what the motto was for those schools, and that alone kind of tells you what those schools, did to our people.
Quannah, I want to ask you to help draw some comparisons between the Line 5 fight and some of the work that you're involved in your community. Line 5 has, I think, somewhat of a lower profile than some other big Indigenous fights against fossil fuel infrastructure. Can you talk about your experience working in the Arctic? And the Willow Project is one that I think has drawn a lot more attention in political circles. Can you talk to us a bit about where things are there?
Yeah. I feel like we're kind of in this weird stage where we're waiting for something to happen, but we're feeling confident as of now. There was so much hard work and so much time. I mean, people don't even realize this has been a fight that's been going on for generations. I'm the 4th generation to be fighting, these corporations and these extractive industries. And that's insane to think about. I don't want to have a kid and think that they're going to have to be the next to continue that fight. They should be able to breathe clean air and drink clean water. That should be our number one right. But for my experience, I've lobbied so much in Congress. I've been in the room of the House of Reps watching them vote on a bill, whether or not they're going to protect the Arctic Refuge from drilling or move forward. And it was the first time I'd actually really seen these reps it's split down the middle. There's the Dems on one side, Republicans on the other. And I was just up there watching them, and it turned into a debate. There were people that weren't even from Alaska telling Alaskans what we should do and what we should do with our land. And it was so hard to sit there and try to explain to them and rehumanize ourselves and tell them that we are people living this life in Alaska where we now can't fish. Our people are banned from fishing, yet they're letting commercial fishermen go fish. There's so many things and so many threats, and having to sit there and defend that and ask for basic human rights is insane. And so being in those spaces, it was so eye-opening to seeing how the world saw us and how the government saw us. And like, you know, showing up, and it's not just showing up politically, like protesting and coming to these conferences and talking. Like, it has been, you know, ongoing hard work, and we're getting somewhere. I mean, they're not drilling in the Arctic Refuge right now, and the Willow Project is kind of like on hold, but there's still processes and policies that they're trying to maneuver around so that they can just go straight in.
I just wanted to ask one more question before I throw over to you on the same topic, but because the Willow Project, today I think a lot of questions for the political speakers that have been on before have been about the current state of the election and Joe Biden, and before the debate through these big open questions, there was a big concern that people who were aligned with climate or environmental activists would be disenchanted with the Biden administration because of the Willow Project. And I'm wondering if that setback, or that, which I'm sure was something you didn't want to see happen, their authorization of the Willow Project, did that cause you to question your support for the Biden administration?
Of course. I mean, I don't think a single Indigenous person actually fully supports a single living entity of the U.S. government. I mean, this government doesn't even see us as people still. Like, we're not even considered, you know, our voices are barely being heard at that level. So yeah, I don't trust the government at all. But I will say those policies are so important, you know, and despite that huge heartbreak, I mean, you know, it is something we grieve. Indigenous people grieve when we lose land. When we lose these fights, we grieve, because it's not just like, oh man, like that sucks that's happening. No, like this really does affect us in our livelihoods, and it's also a big part of our identity and who we are as people. You know, this is a statistic that we see get tossed around a lot, and I've said this so many times, but not a lot of people know it yet. And it's 80% of the world's biodiversity is protected by Indigenous people, and we only take up 5% of the world's population. That's an insane statistic. And if you think about it, like the reason why we have, you know, Yosemite, Arctic Refuge, all of these beautiful wild places that we can escape to is because Indigenous people have been putting their lives at risk at the front lines defending those lands.
That was great. I want to bring it over to you.
Yeah, not to, you know, hammer the Dawes Act into the ground.
But she will.
Right. And I'm going to toss it to Mary, but at the heart of this, and so much of what the major kind of overarching theme of the movie is about sovereignty, which is the ability for that community, for that tribal community, to decide what happens with their land, what goes in it, what goes on it, who lives on it. And again, you know, and Mary will talk about kind of what's happening with the pipeline now, and there's, you know, a legal struggle, that there's a legal fight. I mean, and the resources that it takes up for people in these communities to have to just be able to say, this is what we do and don't want on our land. Just as, I mean, it's kind of unfathomable for any of us to think that if there were a pipeline going through our backyard, that we wouldn't fight it, that we wouldn't want to,
Yeah, exactly. And you said before, the fight that the Bad River is waging has been low profile. And obviously there's been some press with our film. There will be greater press as we head towards the fall. But therein lies the problem. And that happens across the country. It is very rare to have a Standing Rock situation. Right. It is very rare for an Indigenous community, as Quannah said, fighting for centuries. How often do you hear about those fights? And here the Bad River Band is, and I think they've expended $5+ million to bring this to trial. There was a trial, amazingly. I mean, most Native communities cannot afford that bill.
Yeah, let's like spoil your film here. Can you talk about the end of the film, which, you know, culminates in this big court battle? To me, it's fascinating because it's a case where there is such clear documentation about who should control the land that you show going back into deep history. So, you know, kind of tell us how the court battle that just played out went and what happened.
Yeah, so it's really fascinating. So the federal district court judge in Wisconsin ruled that Enbridge was in a state of trespass, right? They simply didn't have the right to operate. You'd think that would be sort of clear, that's the end of it. Well, because it's in legal terms, it's equitable. I'm a recovering lawyer. Sorry, it's really irritating to everyone I know. But it's equitable relief. So the judge said, well, we need to consider the impact on Canadian consumers. And what's fascinating is this is not a case about oil. It's not. We're a net exporter of oil. This is a case about a piece of infrastructure that no longer has the right to be in the place where it's in. And so right now, Enbridge, the judge did rule in Bad River's favor, but said Enbridge needs to shut down. I'm going to give you 3 years so as not to disrupt the energy markets. 3 years, it should have been, 18 months would have been fine. There's going to be a minimal disruption. Enbridge, of course, has appealed the decision.
And can I ask you, I know you said you didn't want to have to do this, but can you give Enbridge's point of view? Like, what do they argue?
Well, Enbridge has an oil point of view. And as I just said, this is a story about infrastructure. Right. And it's a story about business interruption. Let's call it what it is. Enbridge's position is we have easements. Okay, they expired. We have other agreements that allow us to continue operating until 2046. We should be able to continue operating. Now, I'm going to say that is their position. Their position is lots of people are dependent upon that oil.
Right, that it would be disruptive for consumers.
But it's really, as I mentioned, it'll be disruptive for Enbridge because we have so much, like there's not an oil problem.
How many barrels go through that?
540,000 barrels of oil
and
per
how much do they make off of line foam?
Oh, good question. Aaron, note to self.
I think these are great, yeah.
The court documents reveal that $600 million per year of free cash flow is generated by Line 5. And it's 71 years old, so they've amortized the line over and over and over and over. It is a cash cow.
How much did the band get for having that easement there?
So for the first 40 years, I think it was less than $5,000, maybe $10,000 for the... So effectively, it was a gift from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to Enbridge for the first 40 years. In the 90s, there was an agreement where the BIA said, okay, we're going to give you a little bit more, recognize your sovereignty a little bit more. And the band agreed to $800,000 for 50 years for like one set of parcel. And then the other parcels were 20 years.
So it's a big disparity between the money that the company is making and whatever.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, these are sophisticated cats up there in Canada. And the agreement ended. Like, there's full stop. And so...
So I want to ask two last questions, as we have about 2 minutes left here. Now, one of the big questions I have as an editor of climate journalism is the extent to which courts can be a venue that brings about climate change, or counteracts climate change. After studying this situation and following the case through the courts, do you feel more or less hopeful that courts can be a venue for...
I would say Judge Conley is apoplectic about the potential of a rupture that could happen with the next big flood. He is very well aware of the problem. And he's very, very worried about it. Now it's before the Seventh Circuit. And my hunch is this is going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. If the ban doesn't run out of money, A, or B, if there's not a rupture in the meanwhile.
Wow. And then, Quannah, I want to give you the last word here because you are the activist on the stage. You know, people hearing this discussion and after today going to watch the film, what do you want them to take away? How do you want an audience of people who are here because they share a concern for climate change to, what should they be doing from your point of view as an activist?
Yeah, I just encourage people to really get connected with the community that you are residing in. It's really important to recognize the Indigenous people of where you're at. A lot of the time we just go somewhere and we're like, oh, we're in Seattle, but, there's Indigenous people everywhere. There's Native communities everywhere, and try to find a way to show up for one another. I mean, really just start within your own community, and see what you can do for them. You can try to show up everywhere else, and yes, we need that. Like, that is so important, but we also need people to, start really showing up on the front lines because it can't just be us putting our lives at risk. We need more people. We need allies, and we need people to show up for each other. And with this film, I really hope people learn from it and understand our history. Because like you said, this film turned into like an oil pipeline film to a history learning lesson. And, you know, I know a lot of Native history, but I myself even learned a lot through the film. And so it's very informative. I really hope you learn, and I really hope you take that information and share it. And I really hope moving forward that you are really connected to your humanity the way Indigenous people are. And I really hope that you see yourself as a part of nature, not less than or more than, because when you do that, we end up in these kinds of positions. So
that's a perfect place to leave it. Thank you so much, and please watch Bad River on Peacock.
Thank you. Thank you.